as advertising and talk about the Argosy, particularly operating in the Far East. And as you can see from the title there, it was 63 to about 66, 67 that we were there. At the top left is the original Argosy, the Armstrong-Whitworth Argosy, the very first one. Why they ever decided to call anything else the Argosy, I'll never know, because they only made 10 of the old ones and nobody else wanted them. So that was the way it worked out. And then, of course, you've just been talking about the Civil Argosy. And as you can see, the poor old Armstrong-Whitworth thought they were going to develop something straight away for the Hastings, to replace the Hastings. And they looked at the C119, the boxcar, and decided that that would probably do what they wanted. But by the time they got round to thinking about it seriously, needless to say, the Ministry of Defence cancelled the whole lot. And so they carried on with the work that they were beginning on and made it the 650, which you are probably all more familiar with than I am. Went to the Ministry of Defence, and anybody who knows anything about the Ministry of Defence, they're capable of meddling with anything. And they decided that clearly a replacement for the Hastings, they wanted a navigator, flight engineer. The Army wanted this floor to be capable of taking an armoured car. The range that was specified wasn't good enough, so they put some extra long-range tanks, and they put the supplier's window, and they put the radar in, which gave it the whistling wheelbarrow title, the clamshell doors, etc., and external bomb racks. We could carry 6 1,000-pound bombs screwed to the outside of the Argosy to be able to drop them. And so all the Argosy captains, certainly up to my time, we all had to go and do the visual bombing course. And the only bombs we ever dropped were from a varsity on the ranges in East Anglia. Never, ever saw a bomb put on the side of an Argosy. And I can honestly say I was absolutely delighted that that was the case. The thought of having live bombs on the outside of the fuselage filled me with absolute horror. When we look at the actual aeroplane that we finish up with, I think you'll agree that we have this problem of poor performance, particularly in the high altitudes and the humid conditions. And I don't know whether the Viscount did it, but if you open the throttles quickly, the blades hunted, and it was almost like putting a brake on, which we would later find out was very disconcerting if you were in a ravine and needed all your power that you could do. Open the throttles and it felt as if somebody just put all the brakes on. We also found it was quite limiting because we didn't have any propellers that could be reversed. If we had have had, we might have got into a couple more strips in Borneo, but we certainly didn't. We had a field capability. We could land in long grass, but if you did that and you didn't take the nose wheel doors off, the grass did it for you. So if we had to go into grass strips, that you had to go without the nose wheel doors. And of course, those lovely doors at the back, which were great for supply dropping, they did cause quite a lot of drag. So this made it very challenging, particularly if you were trying to get out of a narrow ravine. For all those who don't know what an RAF squadron looked like, that was us. About 120, 130. I think that was about the only time we were all together. So we had these various other problems that we had to work on. Because they were so-called replacing the Hastings, of course, they didn't actually get the whole coordination right. So we had very, very few pilots with any long-range transport or even tactical transport on the squadron with us. So we obviously had quite a to-do to get everybody operational ready. the other thing, which of course we've got to bear in mind, is that we were then sent out to Singapore, and really only a few weeks later, we had this thing called the Indonesian confrontation, which started up. And this was where Indonesia decided that they would like to have a huge empire, which included all of the Philippines, the whole of the island of Borneo, and Singapore, and the whole of Malaya. And this was a problem, obviously, for the Commonwealth point of view, because we were the guardians of Malaya, which was to become Malaysia. So we found out that the Commonwealth forces were given the responsibility of going to Borneo and stopping the encroachment from the Indonesian side, which they called Kalimantan. And they actually got as far as Kuching on a number of occasions. They also sent C-130s full of paratroops into Malaya to try and take over Malaya as well. So the British government decided that they had got the responsibility to coordinate the activities of all the Commonwealth countries. The problem that we had in Borneo was that the border was 1,100 miles long. Much of it was in mountains. And therefore, defending that border was going to require one heck of a lot of people. So, and when we talk about people, I'll just give you some flavor. Those lovely people at the top left-hand side were Royal Marine Commandos who had just come out of 2 weeks in the jungle. And they tended to work two to 3 weeks at a time, come out for a little bit of a rest, and then they would go back. And you could see the way that they, the indication there was the helicopter that was delivering, because there were virtually no roads anywhere in the area where we were looking at. But there were jungle paths, but you would think the jungle paths might have been put on the maps, but the maps were completely and utterly useless. When you glued your maps together to go and operate over there, the rivers would be about 1.5 inches apart when you put the joins on the maps. So most of the navigators soon learned that they had to actually draw their own maps as they went along. Ammunition. Clearly, people in the jungle could quite reasonably consume quite a lot of ammunition. They used a lot of the claymore mines to defend their positions. They obviously, if they ran out of weapons, we had to drop their weapons, and the flares. They also needed the flares to indicate sometimes where the dropping zones were. Food, we did drop live chickens, which was interesting for the navigators, because one of the factors that you use when you're thinking about throw forward is the weight of the container. But when the chickens go out, they flap their wings. So did you assume that when they went out that they weighed nothing, or did you think that they were going to come back down to the bottom of the container? But anyhow, there was a story, and I don't know whether it's true or not. They tried once to drop a donkey. What happened to the donkey? I have no idea. Clothing, you think, well, for heaven's sake, they surely didn't need clothing. But was such was the system in the United Kingdom that they designed some new jungle boots, which they'd issued to the troops just before they went into Borneo. So they used them partially in Malaya and also in Borneo itself. And they lasted exactly 2 days. So before the chaps went into the jungle, they would buy their own clothing. And indeed, as far as the clothing that we wore, mostly we abandoned the Royal Air Force flying suit because they were too hot and sweaty. And of course, when you got in the cockpit, it'd be, in terms of Fahrenheit, about 100, 110. So we always used to go out and buy Australian flying suits, which were drip dry and really good. Building materials, corrugated iron. There's picture which will come up later, and you'll see that when the troops built their defensive areas, they really liked to keep the rain off, which is quite a good idea, because it rained every day, usually about 3:30. So they wanted corrugated iron, radio spares. And the key thing that we dropped was the fuel for the helicopters. I really take my hat off to the many, many first tourists who were flying the helicopters in the jungle. And of course, they consumed quite a lot of fuel, no roads. So nearly all the fuel they used, once they were in the country, we had to drop. If we could, we tried to drop them on a platform. So we had 4 at a time. So we had 4 44-gallon drums go out with a big parachute. Just that little bit at the end, we sometimes dropped fairly close to the helicopters, but they were sensible enough later on to know that with the shift in the wind and goodness knows what, the accuracy was a bit suspect at times. And what we didn't want was to hit a helicopter. So they used to scoot. Really good idea. 65% of all the area that we were operating looked like that. Dense forest, maps absolutely useless, I pointed out. And the average rainfall was 10 inches a month. So, and really, it used to throw it down. And now in amongst all those trees, we had to try and find the drop zones. And indeed, in amongst those trees, you could imagine that the people trying to get, if they were lucky, they would make a mile in 3 hours. On many occasions, it was that tricky. So there are some of the dropping zones. And the bottom left-hand shows where the helicopters were put on the pads there. And that was a particularly easy dropping zone to drop on, because it was an old missionary strip about 1,000 feet long. Now, if in dire straits, we'd have had reverse propellers, we might have put one down on one there, but we didn't. So there was no question of ever trying to go there. And the one at the top left shows that most of the kampongs were fairly close to the rivers, which is great until when we tried to drop. If we weren't absolutely splendid in a way that we aimed our drops, they would go in the river. And we were not very popular if we did that. And the bottom right-hand one shows how close we were to some of the buildings. And I could certainly remember on one occasion we were dropping and everything seemed to go okay. And we were dropping alongside some long houses. And we used to leave the rear door open because only the loadmaster looking out the back could tell us where the parachute was going to drop, because we were almost bound to go into a bit of a split-arse turn straight away. And I had to cry, "Captain, you know that long house on the right-hand side of the DZ?" "Yes," I said. It's now 2 short houses. When you begin to look at the situation that we had there, so we had the crews who were most of them reasonable sort of people, but very, very little experience, where aeroplanes were very lacking in power. All the dropping patterns that we tended to use had to be different for the Argosy than the other types of aeroplanes because of the power limitation we had. And as far as we were concerned, there were only 2 seasons, the rainy season and the very rainy season, because that was the way it was. Turbulence pretty well all the time. DZ comms, occasionally they would have a drop zone with some radio comms, but more than likely there was nothing at all. So you just got a flare and you just dropped. The enemy guns, the enemy were very antisocial and they had guns on in the south sector. And we know that they shot down a C-130. Fortunately, it was one of theirs rather than one of ours. But we desperately needed some sort of protection because they didn't, when they were using small arms, they didn't use tracer. So we couldn't see if we were being shot at. So we needed some fighter cover. So we had hunters, and we had the lovely old iron triangles out there, the javelins, and they would fly top cover for us. But of course, they had very limited endurance. So God bless them all, they would often shut down one engine, fly around on one engine to try and save a bit of fuel to give us coverage for the best we could. The other problem that we had was very occasionally we were asked to drop 8 one-ton containers on a track. But if we did that, when the load went out the back, you push the control column forward to stop the nose coming up, and you would hit the stops well before the load was out. So there would be a certain period of time when actually the nose was coming up and you were completely out of control. Character building, I think they call it. When we went back to the bases, the two bases we used, one in Labuan and one in Kuching, all they had was an NDB, no aids at all to speak of. So what we had to do then was to work out an Argosy capable system. And we had to do that on 20 dropping zones. And we had safe, as far as we were concerned, was if you could cope on 3 engines. And I was given the job of going out there and flying on 20 DZs to work out what the safe system was. And so I thought it was a good idea to throttle one engine back, and did the whole thing on 3 engines. We then made notes like an airfield approach chart, so that the guys knew that if they lost an engine, that they would survive, because we gave them escape routes, altitudes to fly, etc.
It's all in there, doesn't it?
But my co-pilot wasn't particularly impressed. He was a first tourist. He'd only ever flown in Lincolnshire. And there he was with this clown, me, in the other seat, who got a perfectly serviceable engine throttled right back and doing twirlies in amongst the trees. He's forgiven me. We're still friends, by the way. I should make that quite known. But yes. I've put a bit of video in here. It's not very good video. There's the javelin in the foreground. That was a 44-gallon drum being thrown out the side door. So the interesting thing is, look at the angle of bank that we needed to use. 45 degrees, 50 degrees of bank in amongst all the trees was the norm. This is Labuan, where you've got the Beverly, you've got the Hunters in the Argosy, they're all in mixed in together. I'll go back just a bit. Now, one of the big problems that we had whilst we were in Borneo is because it was an undeclared war. And Dennis Healy, who was the Secretary of State for Defense at the time, had heard the terminology from the Indonesians that it was called confrontasi. So we used the term confrontation, which he called his secret war. He kept the journalists away. Hardly anything was heard in the press about what we were doing or anything like that. And initially, of course, because we weren't officially at war, there was no question about crossing the border. However, you can envisage the problem that we had. It'd be a bit like if you went to a football match and you wanted to keep the crowd off, you don't let them stand on the touchline. So it was decided that we were allowed to do shallow penetrations. But because these were undeniable acts, they all had to be particularly approved. And this was called Operation Claret. So in fact, what the SAS, the SBS, and the Gurkhas in particular used to do was to try to intercept the attackers and deal with them before they got to our side of the border. Occasionally, we would put a helicopter over there, but that was not very popular because you can imagine if the helicopter was there, it gave away the position of the troops. So by and large, they went with what they could carry. And they would actually undertake all sorts of military operations, usually toward the end at any rate, with a pretty fair degree of success. But just once in a while, we were tasked to go in the Argosy, to go the other side. And typically what the SAS would do would blow up a single tree. They would then let up a balloon, and there'd be just one tree's worth of area that we had to try and drop their weapons and ammunition and goodness knows what into. But by and large, they preferred that we weren't there. But of course, we did have to do some crossing of the border. And I've got there the fact that somebody had a brilliant idea that we should drop leaflets on the Indonesian attackers to persuade them not to come to Malaya and take over Malaya. I think all we actually provided was toilet paper, really, but nevertheless, we just had to go. And we would go low level at night, no lights. And certainly on one occasion I was flying and the navigator was standing up between us. And one of us said, "Oh, look, there's two lights." And oh, thank God for that, we'll be able to go between the ships because we were below deck height at night. And then suddenly we realized that those two lights were actually joined up with the rest of the fuel tanker. So we actually were forced to make flight avoiding action so that we didn't collide with the ship, because that would have been really quite embarrassing. Some of the other special ops that we did, well, I certainly did 12 hours, no lights, no nav lights, no comms, etc. And character building, I think it's called. But anyhow, the most important thing, well, at least my family thought it was important, that we got back. So from the crew's point of view, I just got there a title which I've called the character building things. We were very close to the trees, and once in a while, people did come back with the odd leaf or two on some of the aerials underneath. At one occasion, we did have a 1-ton container with a 42-foot parachute which hung up. It did not detach itself from the aeroplane. And as you can imagine, trying to fly an aeroplane with 1 ton plus a 42-foot parachute oscillating in the breeze meant that was another character building trip. Eventually it broke away and we ended up having to chain the top door to the bottom door so that we could get back, because we were worried if the top door went, it would take all the elevators with it. And that would be thank you and good night. But in terms of success, I've got the one about the dropping of a bulldozer blade. I dropped a blade, Beverly dropped the engine to a bulldozer because they wanted to expand one of the short strips. And we were so proud that we only had a 50-yard discrepancy between the two of us. Unfortunately, there was a river in between, So they then had to work out whether they were going to get the blade to the bulldozer or the bulldozer to the blade on native canoes. So you can see we weren't terribly popular. The one flight that particularly comes back to mind was the Changi, the Changi to Borneo, and they could only make 6,000 feet with full power. And they struggled on and on and on, and eventually they dropped they were Royal Marines who were going straight into battle. And the first Marine got out and was bow-legged trying to walk away. And so somebody had the great idea of trying to weigh a Royal Marine together with the ammunition that he's stuffed in his pockets. And instead of weighing 250 pounds, which we'd calculated, he weighed 450 pounds, and all his mates were the same. So God above knows what the actual weight of the aircraft was. We had some incidents of unserviceability, like having to land with one red light on the undercarriages. And then this last one was certainly one of the ones which was at that particular time. We had an urgent operational requirement. And when they say urgent, you know that it jolly well is urgent. It was late in the afternoon, where we normally didn't fly because the thunderstorms were pretty dreadful at that stage. Anyhow, we just had to get all this ammunition in because the people were under attack, and that was the way it was. And on our way back, we called Labuan when we were about 100 miles away, and they said, "Oh, sorry, the airfield's closed." I said, one of the tropical revolving storms that's been out sitting in the South China Sea has come ashore, so you can't land here, you're going to have to divert. So we said, "Oh, no worry." So we'll fly down to Kuching, which is another couple of hours, but it was okay. They said, "You can't go there either because it's closed. Same storm." So I said, "Well, in that case, we'll go up north then, and we'll go to Jesselton, which is now called Kota Kinabalu." And they said, "That's closed too. You'll have to go back to Labuan, from Labuan, Singapore." And at that stage, of course, we realized this was tricky because we hadn't got any fuel to get that far, because it was completely not forecast. So we then had to decide what to do. We said, "No, we're going to come in and land." And they said, "But we haven't finished yet. The runway's flooded." So we said, "Yeah, but we're still going to have to come in." And they said, "We haven't finished yet. The runway lights have all failed. What are your intentions?" So I just said, "Put a Land Rover on each end of the runway with the lights facing there, and we'll come in and land." But the turbulence was such that the only way that we could handle the aircraft, I got a 21-year-old co-pilot to fly trying to keep the wings level as best he could in this thunderstorm. I gave the engineer the throttles, and I would tell him the rate of descent and the speed he was to monitor and use the power to get to it. And I said that I would be the only one that looked out because there was so much lightning, we all couldn't look out at the same time. And the navigator all this time was trying to guess his way back. No, that I'm sure he wouldn't say guess his way back, but you know what I mean, to try and work out some sort of glide slope. But anyhow, when the alternative was to ditch in the South China Sea, and although Argosy had ditched before, it was inadvertent and it was only into three feet of water. But we made it. Obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be talking to you now, would I? So we had our moments. So no question, the Argosy was not the best tool in the box, but then seldom have military aeroplanes ever worked I mean, you people who've flown civilian aeroplanes have always flown the best, haven't you? Well, possibly you did. But we just had to make the best of it. And in spite of the fact that we had some pretty raw crews in tropical experience, tactical experience, we only seriously damaged one aeroplane, and that was the one with the doors. And if your dropping accuracy was poor, you would have got certainly all the complaints from Marine commandos, and you didn't risk getting a complaint from Marine commandos or the SAS or the Gurkhas if it came to that. So, in essence, the aeroplane was made to work, just the same as it was in the Middle East, operating in the deserts out of Aden and then in Bahrain. So, no way was it a perfect aeroplane, but if you've got the right people, you can get the job to be done. So we got a medal from the Malayan, which is the one that I'm showing there, and we got the Malay Peninsula and the Borneo medal over there, and that was it. But we got one heck of a lot of experience, and I certainly wouldn't have missed it for a world. So, thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That's a beautiful lineup there.
Oh, they're all models.
They're all models, aren't they? Oh, yes.
Yeah. God,
we
would have given our back teeth to have that many aeroplanes serviceable on any one day. Yes.
Yeah.
Richard, you mentioned that the aeroplane was known as the Whistling Wheelbarrow.
Yes.
I believe there's a less salacious name given to the airplane in view of the position of that radar scanner and dome.
You mean the flying tit?
Well, I had it as the whistling tit, but yes.
Yeah. Well, yes. Well, I was being. Well, I did my best until now.
Are there any Argosies in museums anywhere?
There's one at Cosford.
Are you?
And there are bits and pieces elsewhere. Yes, we tried desperately to keep one as a gate guard and failed miserably. But the consolation was that they would put one in at Cosford.
Right, and is that indoors or outside?
Mostly it's indoors, but sometimes it's in store.
Right. Okay, so it's in good hands.
Oh, it's in good hands. It's in very good hands.
And those models that we're looking at the moment, are they Corgi die casts or?
They're die cast. Yeah, they're die cast.
Okay.
Brilliant.
Thank you, Richard. I'll mute now and let somebody else ask questions.
Okay.
Yeah. Did you not have Brunei as a divert while you were there?
No, we weren't allowed to go there. That was politically not acceptable. But the thunderstorm was there in any case.
Yeah.
It's what's known as the Borneo effect. It sort of sucks some of these tropical revolving storms inland, and then feeds on them.
Yeah. So the Sultan needed the help from the British, but the British weren't allowed to go there.
That's right.
And the Indonesian wanted his oil as well.
Absolutely right. Yeah, no question about it.
Yeah, that's why they got rid of him.
Oh, well, yeah, well, there you are. But no.
Am I right in saying that you used Army air dispatchers in the back end of your aeroplane?
Oh, yes. Yes. A pity that video didn't work. I don't know why it didn't. Yes, they were Royal Corps of Transport.
Yep.
And one has to take your hat off to it. The way that they used to get thrown around, as you probably saw when the little bit of the video, we would have 50 degrees of bank on, and these guys would be there preparing the next load. And only once on one flight that I was going on, which was what was a bit sensitive. One dispatcher refused to fly because it was so dangerous. And his boss, who was a captain, immediately stood in and said, I will take his place. Exactly, I will just be one of the humpers and dumpers and I will take his place. They were absolutely wonderful because some of them, you see, would be packing all evening, all night. And then they would fly with us and we would do 2, sometimes 3 trips. And whenever we were going to do a drop, we'd probably do as many as 5 or 10 orbits in the valleys to drop these things, and they would get thrashed around.
I'm pleased to hear you say
we were ever so kind to them because we allowed them to strap themselves to the floor.
Yeah, we also used to get flying pay too. I'm an ex-Royal Corps of Transport air dispatcher.
Well, I can assure you, they were absolutely brilliant.
And I'm pleased to hear it. My service was in Sharjah. I didn't do Borneo, but air dispatch is an entertaining business. And it's great fun to work with the Royal Air Force. I was known as Commander Air Dispatch Gulf, or CADG for short.
You noted that the Indonesians had C-130s. Do you think your life would have been easier if the RAF had bought C-130s and you had those for operations?
Oh, I after the Argosy, I did 2 tours on Argosies, and then commanded a C-130 squadron again with Special Forces. And oh my God, what an improvement! You got oodles of power, very rapid aileron control, which you need in those sort of areas. Robust, easier to get into, etc. Yeah, I mean, no question about it. The C-130 was far superior, but of course it did come along slightly later, but that was the A's and the B's. But of course, the C-130 today is just incredible, the amount of kit they've got into it with the extra bladed propeller.
Was the Beverly any use whatsoever out there?
Well, two very good uses. One, it was easier to put corrugated iron into the back of a Beverly, though on one occasion, a very tidy mind, sorry about this, there's always a downside to the RCT stories on there. They loaded it twice and he struggled a bit to get airborne. But as you could imagine. But the other thing about the Beverleys, our ground crew who were pretty green, I have to say, really, very enterprising, because the Beverleys regularly needed an engine change, and the engines came in big boxes, which were rapidly converted into airmen's crew rooms. The Beverly did a good job. It was not quite as wieldy as we were.
It must have been very out of date, mustn't it? When,
oh, yes.
5, yeah.
No, the problem was serviceability and spares. Somebody did tell me, and I believe it's true, that somebody decided that the best way of getting the spare engines from for the Beverleys in the Far East was to put them as deck cargo on a ship. So they spent about 4 months ingesting salt, and then they put them into the aircraft, and of course they didn't work terribly well.
It's you wonder how we won any sort of skirmish when the kit was useless, but it was down to personnel at the time.
Oh, I think the ingenuity across the board was just phenomenal. And the way that the SAS, the SBS, and the Gurkhas took on, they obviously, that some of them had experience in Malaya, but they really were a force to be reckoned with. You wouldn't want to meet them on a dark night, that's for sure. In retrospect, it was particularly hazardous, and why we didn't lose more aeroplanes, I don't know. But it was brought home to us when we found out there was a rule that they would always take the bodies back. And so sometimes we would being an Argosy and you'd have a freight bay, you know, that brings it home to you.
You mentioned the ultra low level flying, lights out in turbulent conditions on the Argosy. Where did you do the training for that? Was that back in the UK somewhere?
I didn't even learn to fly the Argosy in the UK. I learned in Malta. The only low flying that we did was in Libya. Because I was on SD, I'd spent 3 years doing tactical flying, but most of the others hadn't.
The Argosy just seemed to me a singularly unsuitable aircraft for ultra low level work.
You certainly had to be very careful. That's why I went and did all those routes. And the flight commander that we had, he spoke to the Hastings people, he spoke to the Beverley people, and he said, "Oh my God, what they do," he said, "it's an accident waiting for somebody to happen." So he said, "Get your kit, go to Borneo, work out all the safe routes and all the safety altitudes." And that's why I did it all on 3 engines. I never mentioned the fact if you lost the second one on the same side. We didn't cover that. But I did fly a C-130 with 2 out on one side. That was character building too.
So that little conflict was what, 3 years long?
Yeah, 2.5, 3 years.
Wow. And there wasn't much in the British press about it.
Hardly anything. This is why Dennis Healy declared it was a secret war. I think he probably briefed a few journalists that he felt he could trust, and there were little bits in the paper, but very, very little.
Richard, what about your health? Were there any nasty diseases you picked up or that you're prepared to share with us? That is.
The chaps in the jungle had a hell of a time trying to fight well. I mean, they had tablets to put into the water to drink, but the bugs and God knows what. We weren't too bad, but they did insist that we all did a jungle survival course, which I thought, crash landing an Argosy and think you're going to walk away and do bits and pieces like that. You've got to be joking.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, I think it was on the afternoon of the first day, they said, "Oh, well, we're going to tell you something about the creepy crawlers that you can get into water and if you have to wade." And they then took us to the Mandai swamp and they said, "Right, we're here, see you over the other side, in you go." That was not good. And then we went, to begin with, we were taken into Malaya, and because the terror is still there, we had to wear sidearms. That's all you need to be shot at as well. But there we are. We acted as a crew the first day, and they split us down into 3 the next day and night. And then the last night, you had to navigate for 3 miles and then sleep on your own out in the jungle.
But no long-term health effects. You haven't picked up any nasty liver flukes or heart or anything like that.
No. How many children have you got?
No, but the soldiers definitely suffered.
Yeah.
From any bugs there were.
Yeah.
They would get into awful trouble.
Malaria again as well too. Yeah.
Yes, swamp fever was common with them.
Yeah.
And sometimes they had to actually medevac somebody out of a team. But of course, they didn't want the helicopters to go in unless they were really critically injured, usually associated with being shot at, because that gave the game away.
Yes. Yeah.
And in fact, one of the helicopters was shot down and they never found the crew.
Sycamores, were they? Are the helicopters you used there? Or whirlwinds?
Whirlwinds, mainly whirlwind, but they also had the flying longhouses as well.
The Belvederes.
Oh, the
Belvedere, but I think they couldn't get rid of that fast enough.
So why did the Indonesians not push the issue and pull back in the end?
Yes, eventually they decided that it was a no-win situation. But the Indonesians, to begin with, they were sort of like reservists. Mm-hmm. But when they put their professional people in, they were good soldiers. Oh, I missed out that story. Just when confrontation began, they had some diplomatic arrangement whereby they allowed 3 aeroplanes to go into Jakarta to pick up British citizens who wanted to leave. I went on the 3rd aeroplane, and I think there was some question about my diplomatic clearance. And when we landed, myself and my navigator were marched away. They put a defensive cordon around the aeroplane, and we were put into a cell. We had about 4 soldiers looking after us, so-called, but they were supposedly defending us. But I did say to them at one stage, but why are the guns pointing inwards? And, we had no idea whether we were going to get out or not.
Tricky.
Was all your resupply from the UK by ship? No long-range transport?
Hardly any.
So what was your subsequent aviation career, Richard? Did you join the airlines after leaving?
But that was another joke, of course, is that when I left Singapore, having trained everybody and evaluated everybody operating low level, afterwards they sent me to the Central Flying School to become a flying instructor. And then I went back to the Argosys again, and then flew C-130s.
From Lynham?
From Lynham, yes.
Did you miss out on the Belfast then?
No, it was another military aeroplane, wasn't it? Where the politicians decided Shorts needed the work. So they were, have you got an aeroplane that might do something?
Yeah.
Yes, very slowly. I only joined for national service, by the way. It took me 27 years to find the door out.
Did you have a desk job then at any time, or did you manage to keep flying?
No, I didn't stay flying.
No.
I worked in Whitehall for about 8 years.
Where did you go afterwards? Teaching at Cranfield?
Oh, that's when I became a professor, yes.
Would you do it all again?
Absolutely. Certainly the Borneo part of it.
If you're going to crash in an Argosy, there's a fair amount of leg room, but lots of collapsible stuff underneath you, isn't there?
Certainly on one of my trips, we were ordered to wear parachutes, and they gave us escape and evasion, Second World War escape and evasion maps.
Silk maps and things.
Silk map, yeah, no, Second World War one. But I made my mind up before we took off that I was going to stay with the aeroplane. I'll tell you now, I said to my co-pilot, if I get shot, you're to continue. You're not to turn back.
Did you get to fly the Argosy in any other conflicts?
I did go to Aden. When we landed at some of the airfields, we used to go into revetments made up of oil drums filled with sand to take the small arms fire because they would have a go at us. But it was just different style of flying, but same sort of problem. I felt more at ease in the desert. We didn't quite have the same pace. I looked in my logbook recently, somebody asked me, and I would do 40 trips in 21 days, and that would include between 5 and 10 circuits in amongst those trees on each sortie. You could easily end up doing 30 or 40 runs around in the valleys close to the trees, extremely close to the trees. And then people said, what did you do in the evening? And the answer was sleep.
And drink?
No.
You sent all the rum into the jungle?
I'm glad you mentioned that. The Gurkhas were allowed, when the Gurkhas did a super job, but part of their ration was rum. If anything went wrong with the drop, they would ring in and say that part of the drop needs to be repeated if we dropped it in the river or something like that. Mostly they got boats and they recovered it. But an amazing numbers of bottles of rum got broken as a result of the dropping.
I thought Nepalese didn't drink.
Oh, yes, they did. Oh, yes, did they ever? But they did a super job. Absolutely fantastic job. But one thing I didn't mention, of course, is that our crews also had to be Hong Kong qualified. I flew 2,500, 3,000 hours on Argosys, never shut down an engine in anger.
They were very reliable, the darts, weren't they? Very reliable.
Yeah, we needed 6 more.
You needed 4 times, really.
No, but they were very, very reliable.
A lot of the engines let us down, didn't they? In the aircraft that UK made, they
Yes.
weren't ready. The Britannia suffered from that. The Vanguard.
Well, I think originally we hoped to re-engine with Tynes, but they were just taking forever to get to work. I don't know whether it would have made a great deal of difference in what we did, because we just shut up and got on with it.
Anyway, thank you very much, Richard. Really
Thank
good.
Thank you,
Yeah.
thank you, gentlemen.
Super. Thank you very much.
Great evening.
Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, bye.